Hi everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this recording. This particular session will cover data collection methods, theme 3, and we are busy with learning unit 3. This is the content that should have been covered on the 30th of July, and it will be split into two recordings. The reason for this is the learning objectives ask us to describe the differences between quantitative, qualitative, and mixed method research approaches, as well as their uses. And I am splitting the two, or splitting this content or video into two, so that this particular recording that you're looking at now focuses on quantitative research approaches or quantitative methods, and the following video focuses on qualitative methods. It will allow you to narrow or specifically home in onto the one that is applicable for your research study. And if you are doing mixed method, you are required to watch both videos. And alternatively, if you want the insight from both quantitative and qualitative research methods, you could opt to watch both videos. So just for clarity, this particular video is going to focus on quantitative data collection methods. Now, our chapter 12 focuses mainly on surveys, experimental designs, and then we're going to conclude with content analysis. Now, surveys, there are two key things that we consider when we start collecting data. We consider when they are conducted over a period of time, which means it's going to be over a longer period and your data is collected more than once. We consider this as longitudinal studies, and here you will utilize a longitudinal survey. But if you are going to conduct your conduct only or collect your data only at one point in time, we call this a cross-sectional study. So you're going to see your sample once, collect your data, and then conclude or follow the next steps of the research process. This is called cross-sectional studies. We also have what we could consider as a pre-test or post-test, and this is generally considered to be known as before and after survey designs, and it measures the changes in a situation, in a problem, or even attitudes. So this is where you test. I generally use it to test it before I start with a smaller sample, if my sampling method or my design, my instrument is going to be useful, or just to check if it's going to work out. I test it with a smaller sample. So generally pre-test or post-test are utilized through surveys. Now, several types of longitudinal surveys that exist, and we cover three of them in this particular chapter. We've got a trend, cohort, and a panel longitudinal surveys. By trend, all that you need to think about here is that we cover the past, what happened when we look back in time. So if you look back at what fashion trends were happening, how learning styles happened in the past or prior to the current or present tense that you are in. So if that is the survey questionnaire that you're going to ask, it would lean towards a trend longitudinal study. If you're going to look at a cohort, here you're looking at the same sample that you are using or same population, but you split that population into three groups or several groups depending on how many you have. And each particular group will answer your particular questionnaire. But they are still the same sample, it's just various groups. A panel, however, is one particular group where you are going to collect data from at different times. So let's say at the beginning of a class, when lectures have just started, you collect data. Midway, just before assessment start, and at the end of assessment, you collect again. If you're doing it at these three intervals or these three specific points in time, we consider that as a panel. So these are the longitudinal survey options that you have. And as I mentioned in the previous slide, longitudinal studies happen over a period of time. We also then have various surveys that are mentioned, or different types of surveys. We've got mail surveys, which are generally the easiest one, where you would access your participants through sending them an email. They could generally click on a hyperlink, open a Google form or a monkey survey, and answer your responses. If you're taking this type of approach, we would generally call this a mail survey. Secondly, we've got a telephonic survey, which is you answering a phone telephonically to answer the particular questions. But take note, it does not lean towards qualitative. There is no option to elaborate or it doesn't become an open-ended question because now it's a telephonic conversation. You're still answering the same closed-ended questions that were structured in the questionnaire. Similar to a personal interview type of questionnaire or survey, here you are going to answer the questions as structured, but just in an interview type of way. Examples here are given of a Zoom call or MS Teams or Skype where you have access to see the individual, but merely working through the questionnaire, and the questions again does not change. We also then conclude this particular portion of the work by focusing on a group administration. Just as it says in the name, here a group is going to administer or complete your survey, but at the same time during one particular session. Next up, there's different types of questions that you can consider for your particular survey or questionnaire. And what they've done on page 172 all the way to page 174 is give you various options of questions and examples thereof. It would be useful to reflect on those when you structure your questions. They also add any problems associated with certain wording of questions that we need to be mindful of on page 175 all the way to page 177. And these are useful for us because we often make mistakes and don't necessarily think about the interpretation of our questions for the participant when they read it. For example, the first example says double-barreled questions. And this is often where you ask two questions in one particular question, which can confuse the participant or allow you to not gain sufficient evidence because they'll only answer one half of the question, etc. So to avoid that, we make our questions more shorter and more direct and to the point. But please work through the table and align your questions accordingly. Next up, we focus on the different type of scales that there are in quantitative study. We've got nominal scale, which is at the bottom or the lowest level of measurement. We've got ordinal, interval, and then ratio is the highest level of measurement. Nominal starts at a simplistic point, and then you work your way up all the way to a more complex or the ratio higher level of measurement. Okay, so for nominal, here we're speaking about measurement that classifies data into distinct categories with no order or ranking imposed. For example, we expect our categories to be mutually exclusive, meaning that they belong to a specific category only, or they are exhaustive, where all the elements of your population will fall into one category. And then finally, there are no mathematical significance yet in this particular level. Example that I tried to depict on the screen was a gender where it's male, female, or non-binary as an example. You could also think of marital status as one where you're just asking, are you married, divorced, or single? Blood types, is it AB or O? It depends on these specific distinctive groups that your sample will belong to. We then move over to ordinal, where we consider here uncommon variables. So the measurement here classifies into categories that can be ranked or in a specific order. So categories here are mutually exclusive and exhaustive. There's a specific order or ranking, and the intervals in between when you're collecting your data are not necessarily equal in this particular option or level of measurement. An example I can give and try to depict on the slide was an educational attainment. So generally, if we all start school at the same time, there is no guarantee that everybody will finish at the same time. Even customer satisfaction ratings, for example. You can be satisfied, unsatisfied, satisfied, or very satisfied, depending on how you experience that particular journey or experience. Next up, we've got interval level, which is probably the opposite of ordinal level. Here, the intervals have equal distance. So the interval measurements involve data that can be ordered and have meaningful, consistent intervals between values, but they lack a true 0 point. And I try to depict on my slide again, the temperature in Celsius is an example We can use IQ scores as an example as well, or even dates in a calendar. These have exact intervals between them, equal intervals. And then lastly, ratio in levels. These are at the higher measuring level, and it includes all the properties of interval measurements plus a 0 point. So here, generally, the categories are ordered. They have equal interview points, as well as examples that I could give here is your weight, your height, your age, even your income. That's an example of ratio measurement levels. Please do dive more into the content on page 179, and there is a table that also summarizes it on page 189 in order for you to apply which ratio would be applicable to you. One that is quite common is a Likert scale, and generally here we use it for from strongly agree to strongly disagree. We often come across a Likert scale, and these are also options for you to utilize because it's one of the most widely used survey responses, and it requires your responses to tick the boxes accordingly from strongly agree, which would be 1 to all the way to 5, or in vice versa, depending on how you would like to draft or draw it up. And you can see examples of that on page 183 of your prescribed material. What's key for us to talk about, and we'll come back to disadvantages or advantages, or you could refer to it as well on page 184. But one of the second points that we need to dive into is experimental designs. Now, here we test the effect on an intervention, the outcome of it as in independent and dependent variables, pre-test and post-test, experimental and non and control groups, and we often compare the two. So in experimental designs, we test the effect of an intervention. The research tries to control other factors which might influence the result. And there's two types of experimental designs that are mentioned for you to look into, as in quasi-experimental designs as well as a true experimental design. Now, these two are embedded in your textbook as well. A quasi-experimental design is the type of design that aims to evaluate the effect of an intervention or treatment without the strict control or random assignment used in the true experimental design. A true experimental design, on the other hand, is used to test an hypothesis and evaluate the effects of one or more independent variables on a dependent variable. What's important here to consider is that for a quasi-experimental design, characteristics such as the lack of random assignment, participants are not randomly assigned to a treatment or control group, or instead the groups may naturally occur or assigned based on the criteria of the researcher. There's comparison groups. There's typically a treatment group or a comparison or control group to evaluate the effects of an intervention. So, for example, you could test with one classroom if they have been trained on AI and another if they have not, and see how they experiment or explore with AI powered tools, for example. And then pre-test and post-test, I've mentioned earlier on, measures are often taken before and after an intervention. So those are quasi-experimental design characteristics. But a true experimental design characteristics or components would consider the key variables. So, for example, it would have an independent variable. This is the variable that is manipulated by the researcher to observe its effect. There's a dependent variable, the outcome or response that is measured to assess the effect. And then random assignment, the process of randomly assigning participants to different groups. Control groups, we've mentioned earlier on, these are the groups that do not receive the experiment treatment and could be used as a benchmark. And the experimental group are the group that could receive the treatment on the other hand. Control groups and experimental groups are often compared in quantitative study. But these particular options, considering a quasi-experimental design and a true experimental design, is something you need to consider if it is applicable to your study, and which one are you leaning towards. Do you have two groups that you are looking at, one control group and one experimental group? Or do you have a specific example of just randomly assigning your participants are not randomly assigned to an experiment, and then make a decision on which experimental design you are opting for. Is it a quasi-experimental design or a true experimental design? You could read up more about this on page 187, and to give yourself more context as well. We're now going to look into categories of evaluating uh, your data. And here I would like to move to page 195. And I explained these three terms earlier on, but I just want to emphasize on it in conclusion of this particular recording, where the criteria of evaluating categories are mutually exclusive, exhaustive, or equivalent. When you page over to page 196, you would be able to see examples of mutually exclusive versus not mutually exclusive, as well as an example of an exhaustive category. The reason why I've got a pack of cards or a deck of cards falling on my slides, it was to depict that particular examples that they are giving. So mutually exclusive, we can see that on page 196, they've got aces and kings, and these are mutually exclusive, as in the response can't be both. But in a mutually exclusive, it can be either or, as well as when you look at the example of where categories are exhaustive. Please look at those to depict and understand or get clarity on the various categories that you are going to use or evaluate from. But mutually exclusive, each unit of an analysis should fit into one category. For exhaustive, all your data should fit into a category. And then equivalent, each category must carry equal weight. Thus, no category is more important than the other. So consider in which of these or which are applicable to your particular study. We conclude with considering the steps in content analysis as follows. So you are required in the beginning to read the text several times before to make notes and gather relevant information. Thereafter, you're going to go through your notes and list the different types of themes that emerge. Once you've listed the themes that emerge, you're going to read through the list and categorize each item in a way that describes what it's about. And here you are going to form operational definitions. You're going to use those operational definitions to code your data and place the information in a particular category. And if you are using additional coders, you will need to train your coders. These are if you have people assisting you in analyzing your data, and you're going to have to ensure that they understand the reliability test to ensure that the coding is reliable. So once you have all your categories, you're going to identify the categories that can be linked in any way or group together. And here you're going to determine whether each major category consists of other minor categories. And this is to check whether your categories are mutually exclusive. If you are working with more than one transcript or more than one particular group, you're going to repeat this first few steps with each transcript. And when you have done the above with all the transcripts, you're going to collect the categories. This will allow you to examine each category in detail and consider its relevance. You're going to ask yourself if it will help you to answer your research questions or to test your hypothesis. Number 8 and final steps are you're going to check to make sure that you have captured all the relevant data from the transcripts and code it to fit into one of your categories. Lastly, it will depend on what you wish to achieve through the content analysis. You can now apply an appropriate statistical test to analyze your data. And that brings us to the end of the quantitative data collection. It does take some time to familiarize yourself with what exactly your study wants to entail, but in summary, we have two options that we looked at. We looked at surveys and we looked at experimental designs. Consider your approach that you want to reach. What is the aims in your study and what are your research questions? And align your quantitative data collection methods accordingly. Kindly note that next week on the 6th of August, we will be covering our research proposal task 3. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this recording, and I'll see you in the next live session.